Now, I want to move on now to 8 and ask this question, does evangelism frighten you? And I think if we are honest about this, most of us would say, yes, it does. There are things that we're afraid of. And that's one of the main reasons that Christians don't share their faith and don't take the opportunities that they're given. It's interesting. I think this is fairly standard across cultures, but there are 3 main things that come up. And I didn't make this up while you were talking. This is in the course. So the first one is losing friends, and we have to admit this is a risk. There are people who will not like us because we are Christians and because we share our faith with them. And of course, remember, Jesus was absolutely perfect in everything he did, but some people hated him so much that they wanted to kill him, and they did in the end, and the apostles faced difficulty. So this is a real thing, that we may lose friends, or we may never even start to make friendships because the world will get around, and that is a cost. It's part of the cost of belonging to Christ. But I think it's a bigger fear than we imagine, because what people really do appreciate in a friendship is openness and honesty. And if we're talking with them at a deep level about what is really important to us, we might find actually that a friendship deepens as a result of that. But losing friends is one thing. The second one is this whole idea of appearing judgmental, that I'm a Christian, I'm going to heaven, you're not, you don't believe, you're going to face judgment. People get these messages and they understand that we're saying that we're better than they are, that they're bad people, we are good people. Of course, this is the very opposite of the gospel, because the gospel, Christians are not good people. They're bad people who recognize they're bad, that they need God's forgiveness, and they need to change. And so it's the very opposite. And when people really understand the message of the gospel, that we're all sinners, we're all separated from God, we all need his forgiveness, then it will be less of a problem that we will appear judgmental. We are like one beggar telling another beggar where to find food. Of course, we have to be very careful in our attitude, the way that we come across. And then the other fear is not knowing how to answer their questions. So it might be that we just don't like being in a situation where we're disagreeing with people and where tempers might become raised, and there might be strong emotions expressed. But more often, it's just that they might ask questions that we don't know how to answer. And we're afraid of getting into a situation where we're made to look silly, or just where we feel we're letting God down because we're not able to give an account of the truth and persuade people. Now, we need to remember, of course, that it's God's work. We looked at the sovereignty of God previously, and how God opens doors, gives us boldness, brings conviction, opens people's hearts to understand. We know that God's sovereign at every element. But we also need to be able to know how to answer their questions, because some questions are just people's attempt to confuse us and throw us away. But many questions people are asking because they are genuine obstacles to them believing. And we must cater for people's intellectual integrity and take their questions very seriously. So let's think about those questions. And I want you now, just in the group here, to tell me what these questions are. And if you're teaching this, then what I'd encourage you to do is to write the questions up on a whiteboard. We could try and do this here possibly. So if I try and share a whiteboard, hopefully you can see a whiteboard, can you? Yeah.
Yes.
And I'm not a very good typist, but tell me what these questions are. Tell me about the questions you've been asked. Just call them out.
Is there salvation only in Christianity?
Okay.
Why God
Is
needs to
Jesus
create
the
a
only
hell?
way to God? Why did God create hell? Yeah.
Some
What else?
people ask questions that why does bad things happen to good people?
Yeah.
If God is love, why does he order a slaughter of women and children and everybody like the Amalekites, annihilate them?
Okay. We could choose the Amorites, the Amalekites, couldn't we? I'll go for Amorites because it's easier to spell. Yeah.
How can you prove that the Bible is inspired by God?
Yeah. Come on, there must be hundreds of these questions. What are the ones you've been asked?
Why do you have 3 gods?
What kind of context that will come up? What sort of person is typically going to ask you that, Hedron?
Muslims.
Muslims, yeah. It's a classic question from Muslims. Yeah.
You believe that because you are born as a Christian, but people born in other religious background will believe in other way.
So this people will often say, you're only a Christian because of the way you were brought up. The idea that psychological or social forces have shaped us. Yeah. Okay. Any others?
Every culture have their own God. Why do Christians think that your God is the only one? That's another question.
So that's a bit like the first one, isn't it? Is Jesus the only way to God? But, what about all the other religions? Classic question. You get that in all cultural contexts, I think.
Is there salvation before Christ came to this world, or some remote area who didn't listen to the Bible, they do not have a salvation?
Yeah. So am I hearing this right? What about those who have never heard the gospel? How can God send them to hell?
One question that I hear a lot here in Brazil is why God condemns people just for being homosexual. I know that this is a type of questions that even some Christians are disagreeing now, but here in Brazil, and this can be other than why happiness can be condemned by God.
And that the questions around sexuality and especially around LGBT issues, very common now, especially in the West. Okay, well, look,
And-
let's oh, Yusuf, yeah, have you got one?
Yeah, I think, yes, I think if you said Jesus is God, why should he have to die on the cross while God doesn't die? Yeah.
Now, that's an interesting question. What kind of person would ask you that?
Yeah, I think it's commonly asked by the Muslim, because where we are
Exactly.
working and living Islamic context, this is one issue of difficulty of the cross, and that God never dies. And so I think you have answered this in the previous session, the importance of the cross. Yeah.
Absolutely. So that's a Muslim question. Now, you've got quite a good list there. There's about 10 or 11 questions that you've got, and we could carry on with this exercise. But even now, we're finding the same things are coming up again and again. And I think
one more.
what I'm wanting to demonstrate to you is that there are a limited number of questions that people ask, and they are always the same kind of questions, and they come up again and again and again. Let's just come back to here again, and I'll share my screen once more. Now, a list of questions that American called Paul Little put together is become known as the 7 deadly questions, and several of these have already come up in your list. Let me tell you what they are. This was in an American context when I was growing up as a student, but many of them are still the same. Is Christ the other way to God, the only way to God? Or it might be, what about all the other religions? Would be this other way it would be asked. Isn't questions about the Bible, isn't it full of errors, contradictions? How can we trust its history? How do you know it's true? Isn't Christian experience only psychological? So people might say, oh, you only believe in Christianity because you were brought up that way. If you were brought up as a Muslim or a Hindu, you would believe something else. Or they might say that you only believe because you want to believe, because of the benefits of believing. So this one didn't come up, but how can miracles be possible? And maybe quite a few of you are living in contexts where people believe that miracles are possible, but certainly in the post-Christian West, this is a big question. Miracles aren't possible because they break the laws of nature. What about those who've never heard the gospel? And the question behind this, of course, is it's not fair. How can God send people to hell when they have never had a chance? Why did the innocent suffer? And this came up. Why did bad things happen to good people? One of you asked, but why did? Or it might even be a more aggressive question. How can you justify the slaughter of the Amorites? Not only is suffering happening, but God is causing it according to the Bible. And then the final one is, won't a good moral life get me to heaven? And this is very common in all cultures, that people believe that if you're living in a good way, then if there is a heaven and there is a God, then you should be on the right side of that judgment. So these are the 7 deadly questions. Now, there's another. I'll show you another list which is quite similar. This was a man called Paul Weston, who was an evangelist, and he went out into the streets of London, and he asked people why, firstly, if they were Christians or not, if they believed in God, and if they said they didn't, he said, well, why don't you believe? So he turned it around the other way. Why don't you believe? And he got 6 answers, and you'll see there's quite a lot of overlap with these two. There's no proof. Often these people have never actually looked at the evidence. Christianity is irrelevant. That's very common in the West now. People aren't even asking the question about who Jesus was because they're so tied up with other things that are more important to them. I've never really thought about it, was another one. The big obstacle is the church, and Harold mentioned this before, the problem of hypocrisy. And this is very big in the West now. People will refer to stories of particularly sexual abuse or spiritual abuse in the church, child abuse and so on. There's so much suffering in the world, and Christianity can't be the same only way to God. So it's the same question. So you see there's quite a lot of overlap between that. Now, my point is that there aren't hundreds of questions. There aren't even dozens of questions. when non-Christians are asking you questions, there's a relatively small number that we're going to be asked. And if I was to say to you, if you were sitting a really important medical or dental exam, and you had a dream the night before the exam, and you knew it was a prophetic dream, God was speaking to you in the dream, and you saw a copy of the examination paper with all the questions written on it. And then you woke up, a bit like Daniel getting a revelation in the middle of the night. The first thing you do would be to go away and learn the answers to all those questions, wouldn't it? What we often do when we're studying for exams is that we'll go back and look or ask the people in the class ahead, what did they ask last year? Or maybe look at copies of old examination papers to know the kind of things that are coming up. And if I was to say to you, what's the more important exam? Is it the exam at medical school, or is it the exam at the end of time when we stand before the Lord and he asks us questions? I'd say that's a much more important exam with much bigger consequences. And so if we know there are a limited number of questions, and for these questions there are good answers, then I think there's not really any excuse for us as Christian believers not to know how to answer these questions to a reasonable degree. That's my point. Now, it's been said already, Gabriel was saying in Brazil, it's very common you'll get questions about sexuality, and questions in a culture will change over time, and they're different between cultures. So let me just show you, these are very common ones at the moment in Europe. God is a moral monster. So, you know, who can believe in a God who agreed with slavery and slaughtered the Amorites and the Amalekites and the Canaanites and so on? So that's quite a big question, the injustice of God. Sex and marriage, but also particularly now around LGBT, homosexuality, transgender, those kind of issues always will come up in a Western context. And then there'll be questions around ethical issues, and especially abortion tends to be the really big one, because people think abortion should be widely available. And then the other question we get is that what we call the intolerance of Christianity. Christians are judgmental, intolerant people who don't accept others. That's very common now in a post-Christian society. Now, maybe you get these questions, maybe you don't. The point is that in every culture, even though there are different questions, there are a limited number of questions, and we can learn the answers to them. And now we've I talk here about the three exchanges of Romans 1. That simply means that in Romans 1, Paul says that human beings exchanged God for idols. First of all, that was the first exchange. Then they exchanged truth for lies. And then they exchanged natural for unnatural. God for idols, truth for lies, natural for unnatural. And these questions are coming out of that kind of culture. It says that God gave them up. And that's quite a good description of the West. But let's just think about Islam for a moment, because Yusuf and Hedwin, you're both coming from Islamic contexts. And Hedwin said the question, you know, how can you believe in three gods? And Yusuf gave us a question that was also a Muslim question. And so here are the 7 deadly Muslim questions. These will always come up when you're talking to Muslims. When I get into conversations with Muslim taxi drivers in the UK, or speak to Muslims at Hyde Park Speaker's Corner in London, or within our town, hasn't your Bible been corrupted? What about the predictions of Muhammad in the Bible? So Muhammad is talked about in the Bible. They'll take you to, usually they take you to Deuteronomy 18 and the Holy Spirit passages in John 14 to 16. How can you worship three gods? That is Hedwin's question. Why is there any need for a cross? Surely God can just give forgiveness, or how can God actually die? This was Yusuf's question. How could God allow his son to die? How can God die? And then there'll be arguments about the Quran. It's clearly God's word because of its scientific insights. Or this is another big one we get. How can Christianity be true when the West is so corrupt? Look at you. You kill your children. You practice sexual immorality, and this is all because of Christianity, because it's a corrupt religion. So what we've seen today is first of all, that the place of dialogue in the lives of the apostles, the natural way they did evangelism, was to do it in words people understood, in an environment where they felt comfortable, and with the opportunity for discussion. That was the way the apostles did it, in a good way, model for us to follow. We looked at the fears of losing friends, of appearing judgmental, but especially the questions people would ask. And then we've thought a bit about what those questions are, and we've seen that there are not an unlimited number of questions. There's a manageable number of questions, and they're not too difficult to provide a good answer for. Now, if I was teaching this in an open group, not here, although we're going to do this a bit later, I would then role play the 7 deadly questions. In other words, what I'd do is put people in pairs or in groups, and then I'd pretend to be the non-Christian, and I would come along and ask them the questions. I'd give them a chance to learn up on the questions first of all, and then I'd get them up in groups and give each group a different question, and then I'd say, okay, well, you believe God can do everything, and he knows everything, and he's kind. So if he knows everything, he must know about evil and suffering. If he's kind, he'd want to do something about it. And if he's powerful, he'd be able to. So why doesn't he? Why is there evil and suffering in the world? So I'll start off with that, and then get them to answer, and then follow up the questions. And the whole point of doing this is that you're showing them that they can do it, that this is a learned skill that you can get better and better at by doing it, and that it's worthwhile going away and being able to study the answers to these questions so we can train others, and also answer the questions that we might be answering ourselves, but also give an account of the faith that we have in St. Peter's words, with gentleness and respect, 1 Peter 3:15.